The night air reeked of smoke and blood, and the echoes of screams still clawed at her ears. A girl barely 12 hid beneath shattered beams, trembling, her small hands slick with dirt and grief. Across the ruin of her home a shadow lingered, the man who had killed her family, yet whose gaze now held a storm of something she couldn't name. Regret, guilt, or a promise that would define. The first rays of dawn slashed through the broken roof of the cabin, painting the walls in streaks of gold and ash. She sat in the corner, knees pressed to her chest, still shivering from the night that had stolen everything she had ever known. Her eyes were wide, haunted by the memories of her family's cries, the fire that swallowed her home and the faces twisted in terror and agony. And yet the man who had caused all of it sat across from her, quietly mending the tattered roof beams, his hands steady but his jaw tight, as if the weight of unseen guilt was breaking him from within. She hated him. Every fiber of her being screamed it, but beneath the rage and fear, a spark of something more tangled stirred. Confusion, curiosity, a raw need to survive. She had expected him to leave, to disappear into the smoke and shadow, like every villain in the stories her mother used to read aloud. But he didn't. He stayed, a silent, imposing figure whose presence filled the ruined cabin with tension that pressed against her ribs. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice small but trembling with anger. Her eyes darted to the makeshift weapon she had clutched all night, a splintered piece of wood, sharpened at one end. The man didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, eyes dark and unreadable, yet softer than she had imagined a killer could ever appear. "I'm here," he said, his voice low, careful, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "Because if I leave, you won't last the week on your own." Her grip on the wood tightened. Every word from him felt like a knife twisting deeper into her wounds. But beneath the sharp edge of fear, an uncomfortable truth began to settle in her chest. He was the only thing standing between her and the cold wilderness that promised death to anyone alone. She remembered her mother's face. The last words whispered in her ear before the flames swallowed her. Survive, no matter what. And now survival looked like trusting the man who should have ended her life. Every instinct rebelled, screaming that it was impossible, unnatural. And yet watching him move quietly, carefully, patching what the fire had destroyed, she wondered, was there more to him than the monster she believed? The cabin smelled of smoke and damp wood. Outside, the wind whistled through the skeletal trees, carrying the distant calls of crows. Every sound sharpened her senses. Every shadow seemed alive. Every creak of the broken floor beneath their feet a potential threat. And yet, as the hours passed, a fragile rhythm settled. He worked, she watched, the air between them tense but steady. The unspoken agreement that neither would harm the other became a fragile thread of connection in a world that had ripped everything else away. At night, she would lie awake listening to the wind, trying to understand why he stayed. Was it guilt, mercy, or something darker, something that had yet to reveal itself? She didn't know, but she had no choice. She needed him, even if every breath she took reminded her of what he had done. And as the first day ended, and the cabin grew cold and quiet, she realized something terrifying. Trust would be her greatest enemy, and perhaps her only salvation. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and somewhere outside the crows cawed again, as if mocking the fragile bond forming in the ruins of her world. Tomorrow she would have to face him again, and maybe, just maybe, the truth of what he wanted from her, and what she wanted from herself, would begin to surface. Night fell like a dark blanket over the ruined forest, and the wind moaned through the skeletal branches outside the cabin. She crouched by the weak fire, hugging her knees, staring at the flickering light that barely held back the shadows. He moved silently behind her, carrying a bundle of supplies he had scavenged earlier. Dried roots, water in a cracked bottle, and a piece of stale bread. Each step he took seemed deliberate, careful not to startle her, yet heavy with the unspoken knowledge of what he had done. She didn't speak. Her throat was tight, the memory of her family's screams lodged there like broken glass. Every instinct screamed at her to attack, to run, to vanish into the cold night. But her limbs were weak from hunger and fear, and even the forest beyond seemed to watch her, waiting for a mistake. "Eat," he said softly, placing the bundle a few feet away. "You need strength. You can't survive on hate alone." She glared at him, eyes blazing. Hate, yes, hate was easier than confusion. Hate gave her something to cling to when the world felt like it had collapsed entirely. But even as she pulled the bread toward herself, her fingers brushed against his hand. She flinched violently, but he didn't recoil. He only watched, a strange, unreadable expression etched across his face. "I don't want your help," she spat, but her voice cracked. The lie tasted bitter. "I know," he said quietly, crouching across from her. "And I don't want to give it. But you're alive because of me right now. That's the truth. You can hate me, curse me, and you should. But running from reality will kill you faster than I ever could." The firelight danced across his features, revealing the fine lines etched by guilt and years of hard living. For a moment, she saw something she wasn't ready to understand. A man burdened by regret, maybe even longing for redemption. She shook her head, trying to banish the thought. Monsters didn't feel regret. Monsters didn't care. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low, distant growl. Her heart jumped violently in her chest. The man's eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin. "You hear that?" he asked, voice tense but controlled. "Wolves?" she whispered, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Maybe," he said, standing and grabbing a heavy branch as a makeshift weapon. "Or worse. You need to stay close to the fire. Move slowly. Don't make noise." She watched him, every movement precise, every breath measured. And then it hit her, the truth she had been denying. He was protecting her. Not out of duty, not out of mercy, but something far more complicated. She didn't understand it, and that terrified her. The growl grew louder, closer. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to hold the wooden shard she had claimed as a weapon. He glanced back at her, eyes locking with hers, and for a fleeting second, the wall between them seemed to shrink. It wasn't trust, not yet, but a recognition that survival required cooperation, even when everything inside screamed otherwise. The shadows outside shifted again, and the cabin door rattled against its weakened hinges. Her breath caught in her throat. The night had brought more than cold and fear. It had brought a reminder that the world beyond their fragile walls was still dangerous, still alive and still waiting to take everything from her. He stepped forward, ready to confront whatever threat lurked in the dark, but paused. "Whatever happens," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of authority and warning, "stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you to." She nodded silently, stomach twisting with fear and something she dared not name. The fire crackled between them, a fragile barrier against the unknown. And as the wind howled louder and the shadows danced, she realized the terrifying truth. Surviving this night meant relying on the man who should have been her enemy. The sun had barely pierced the horizon when the girl awoke to silence heavier than any scream she had ever heard. The forest lay still, yet the air felt electric, charged with a tension that made her pulse thrum painfully against her ribs. She rose cautiously, brushing ashes from her hair, every sense alert. The man was gone, not out hunting, not gathering, just gone. And the forest, once merely indifferent, now seemed alive with eyes whispering secrets she dared not decipher. Panic rose in her chest like wildfire. The wind rustled through skeletal branches, carrying a scent she could not name, but one that made her stomach twist. Smoke, earth, and something sharp, metallic. She gripped her splintered shard, each breath shallow, heart pounding against the hollow of her ribs. Alone, for the first time since the raid. Truly alone. Then a noise, a snapping of twigs, deliberate, controlled, broke the fragile quiet. Her eyes darted, wide and unblinking, and there he was, emerging from the shadows, arms full of supplies, face tight with focus. Relief surged, but it was quickly drowned by a wave of fear. Whatever he had seen was not ordinary. His gaze scanned the tree line, lips pressed thin, muscles coiled like a predator. "They're coming," he said, voice low but urgent. "Not wolves, humans, armed, looking for trouble." She froze. Her stomach lurched, bile rising. Humans, they were supposed to be safe from humans. But the forest had long ceased to feel like sanctuary. Memories of her family's screams, the fire, the chaos, the betrayal, flashed in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. Her hands shook violently, You'll have to trust me, he continued, dropping the bundle at his feet and bending to scoop her up. No questions, no hesitation. If we run, we survive. If we fight, we die. Trust. The word hit her harder than any blow could. Trust him? The man who had killed her family, who had invaded her home, who had forced her into this twisted dependence. And yet there was no time for contemplation. The sound of movement drew closer, deliberate steps crunching over dead leaves. They were close, too close. Over dead leaves. They were close, too close. He pulled her behind a fallen tree, pressed her small frame into the rough bark. His hand hovered protectively at her shoulder, heavy and steady, though she could feel the tension beneath. For a fleeting moment she studied him, trying to reconcile the monster of her nightmares with the man who now shielded her from danger. Confusion warred with instinct, hatred warred with the faintest whisper of understanding. The intruders emerged into view, 4 figures moving with purpose, rifles in hand. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, distorted by the slanting morning light. The girl's pulse thundered in her ears, and for the first time, she realized that survival might demand more than fear. It demanded courage she had never known she possessed. They'll take everything if they find us, he whispered, voice taut. We have to move now, quietly, follow my lead. Step by careful step, he led her through the underbrush, teaching her how to listen to the forest, how to read the slightest shift in shadow or sound. Every footfall was an exercise in restraint, every breath a gamble. And yet, amidst the terror, she noticed something else. A strange rhythm forming between them, fragile but undeniable. The predator and the prey forced into unity, moving as one against the world outside. The forest seemed to close around them, branches clawing at their clothing, roots tripping the unwary, but they pressed on. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming, but she could not falter. To falter was to die. To falter was to lose herself to the past she could never reclaim. As they crouched beneath a thicket, hidden from the prying eyes of the intruders, the man turned to her, gaze intense and unyielding. You're stronger than you think, he said, voice low, almost a growl. But don't forget, every choice matters. One slip and it's over. She swallowed hard, heart hammering, mind racing. The weight of her past pressed on her like a stone, but the weight of the present, of survival, of the man she both feared and depended on, was heavier still. The intruders moved closer, each step deliberate, echoing through the silent forest like the ticking of a clock counting down their lives. The girl crouched low, teeth clenched, her body trembling from exertion and fear. She could feel the man's hand brush hers briefly, steadying her as he scanned the surroundings with hawk-like precision. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. They're scouts, he muttered under his breath, voice tight. They're checking for anyone who survived. The words hit her harder than she expected. Survivors weren't meant to exist. Her family hadn't survived, and now, somehow, she was here, a fragile thread of life dangling in the wilderness, relying on the man who had been the cause of all her pain. Rage bubbled in her chest, raw and bitter, but she forced herself to focus. Hatred couldn't save her. Survival might. A twig snapped sharply nearby, and the girl's heart leapt into her throat. The man froze, eyes narrowing, muscles taut. His gaze swept over her, silently commanding her to remain still. She could feel his tension ripple through her, a tether to reality, a reminder that he was both her protector and her cage. Then the scouts stopped, voices low and muffled. They were close now. Close enough that the girl could see the glint of metal on their rifles, the cruel smirk on one man's face as he searched the undergrowth. Her grip on her wooden shard tightened, fingers turning white. Every instinct screamed to strike, to run, to do anything to reclaim control of a world that had been stolen from her. But she remembered his words, follow my lead. One slip and it's over. He moved like a shadow, fluid and silent, guiding her along a narrow path hidden beneath overgrown roots and tangled branches. Step by step, breath by breath, they evaded detection, each movement a silent prayer. The girl's muscles screamed, lungs burned, but she forced herself forward, matching his rhythm as though their very survival depended on the fragile synchronization between predator and prey. Suddenly, a branch snapped underfoot, loud and accusing. The scout stiffened, eyes darting toward the sound. The girl froze, stomach twisting in terror. The man's hand shot out, gripping her shoulder with unexpected force. "Move!" he hissed, and they plunged deeper into the shadows, hearts hammering in unison. The forest opened briefly into a clearing, bathed in dappled light. They crouched behind a fallen log, sweat and grime clinging to their skin. The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "We're not safe yet," he whispered. "We need to reach the ridge. From there we can see the valley. From there we can decide our next move." She nodded silently, fear and exhaustion warring with a strange, budding determination. The forest was no longer just a place of terror. It was a crucible, forging something unrecognizable inside her. Courage, resilience, and a reliance on the man she hated and needed in equal measure. As they edged toward the ridge, a distant shout shattered the fragile quiet. The scouts had discovered traces of their passage. Panic surged, and adrenaline sharpened every sense. The man glanced at her, eyes dark and unyielding. "Stay close. Trust me." She did, though her mind screamed in defiance and disbelief. She hated him for what he had done, for the world he represented, for the memories he carried as a living scar across her childhood. And yet right now, he was the only thing keeping her alive. Every step forward was a negotiation between hatred and trust, fear and survival, past and present. They reached the ridge as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley below. From this vantage, the girl could see the scope of the threat, the scouts combing the forest like hunters, the wilderness stretching endlessly, merciless and indifferent. The man's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, grounding her, warning her, challenging her to confront the reality of their shared existence. The wind tore through the ridge like a living thing, whipping at her hair, slashing at the thin fabric of her clothing, carrying the scent of smoke and fear from the valley below. She crouched beside him, knees pressed to her chest, eyes scanning the figures moving like shadows among the trees. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to vanish into the void. But there was no void, only the man beside her. The man who had destroyed her past, and now held the fragile key to her survival. "Look," he whispered, voice low and taut, pointing toward the scouts below. "They've split up. 2 are following the path we came from. The other 2 are scanning the open field. If we move now, quietly, we might slip past them." She swallowed hard, mind spinning. Trust him. Trust him. The thought felt like a knife twisting deeper into the wound of her childhood. And yet there was no choice. Survival demanded it. The hatred she carried like a shield against him now felt brittle, inadequate. Every moment on this ridge made it clear. The forest would not forgive hesitation, and neither would the humans below. He handed her a makeshift sling of rope, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief but electric, a reminder of the impossible, contradictory connection forming between them. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured. "Don't let fear betray you." She wanted to spit, to scream, to tell him he had no right, but the sound caught in her throat. Fear had become a companion, an unrelenting presence she could not shake. The weight of his gaze pinned her in place, and something inside her cracked, a small, trembling acknowledgement that she could not face this moment alone. Step by careful step, they descended the ridge, bodies low against the brush, the forest pressing around them with whispered threats. Every snapped twig, every shifting shadow felt amplified, the tension clawing at her nerves. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, mingling with the distant sounds of pursuit, until the world seemed reduced to the narrow path beneath their feet and the steady, unyielding presence of the man beside her. Suddenly, a shout cut through the stillness like a blade. One of the scouts had spotted movement. Panic surged, and the girl froze, eyes wide, fingers tightening on the rope until her knuckles whitened. He grabbed her arm, tugging her behind a boulder as the scout's figure appeared, rifle raised. "Move!" he hissed. Adrenaline ignited her limbs and she ran, stumbling, falling, rising again, following him with a desperate, unthinking obedience. Hatred and fear battled inside her, but neither mattered in that moment. The forest had become a crucible, and survival demanded submission, trust, and courage she did not yet fully understand. They ducked into a thicket, breath ragged, bodies slick with sweat and dirt. For a brief second, the girl allowed herself to look at him. Really look. The lines of guilt etched into his face, the tension in his shoulders. the raw intensity of his eyes as he scanned the forest for the next threat. He had been the cause of her nightmares, and yet here he was, fighting alongside her, shielding her, guiding her through a world that had tried to kill her at every turn. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, firm but not gentle. "Because if I don't," he said finally, voice low, gravelly, "you die. And because maybe I'm trying to atone. Maybe it's the only thing left I can do to balance the scales." The words hit her in the chest, heavy and unexpected. Trust, hatred, fear, and something like understanding collided inside her, chaotic and confusing. For the first time, she realized that survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional. And if she failed to navigate that fragile terrain, she might lose herself entirely. The scout's shouts echoed like a drumbeat of doom, bouncing off the forest floor and ricocheting in her chest. Every nerve in her body screamed, every muscle tensed as if the slightest twitch could betray their hiding place. The man crouched beside her, eyes dark and stormy, scanning the forest like a predator measuring its prey. He had become both shield and anchor, the only reason she still breathed. "Now," he hissed, voice sharp and commanding. "We move." They darted from the thicket, low and fast, weaving through the underbrush with a practiced stealth that made her heart pound even faster. She stumbled once, catching herself on a root, but he was there instantly, hand gripping hers, pulling her forward. Panic and rage collided inside her. Rage at the world that had stolen everything. Rage at him for being both her captor and her savior. Yet in that instant, survival demanded obedience. The scout's cries grew louder. One of them raised his rifle, aiming directly at the ridge where they had been hidden moments before. The girl's chest tightened. Fear clawed at her throat, sharp and unforgiving. She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. "Why should I trust you?" His hand rested on her shoulder, heavy and grounding. "Because if you hesitate," he growled, "we're dead. And you know it." The forest seemed to close in around them, branches clawing at their skin, roots tripping their feet. Each step was a negotiation between fear and determination, and she found herself moving not out of obedience, but because she wanted to survive. Because despite everything, she had no choice. Suddenly, a rifle cracked. The shot whistled past, close enough that the girl could feel the wind from the bullet. She screamed, stumbling, but his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her to safety behind a fallen tree. Her body shook violently, a mix of terror and adrenaline, and she realized with a jolt, she depended on him, not just for guidance, but for life itself. "Keep moving," he barked, eyes scanning the trees for the next threat. "We're almost clear." Every instinct screamed at her to run faster, to escape the memories, the grief, the terror. But he slowed her, forcing her to focus, to think, to survive. Step by step, breath by breath, they made their way through the forest, emerging finally onto a ridge that overlooked a river cutting through the valley below. The scouts were behind them, no longer in immediate reach, but the danger was far from over. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, dirt and sweat streaking her face. He knelt beside her, steadying her, his expression unreadable, dark with exhaustion and something else. Perhaps relief, perhaps lingering guilt. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him fully. The man who had shattered her childhood, who had forced her into this crucible, who now fought beside her against a world that had tried to consume her. Why do you care?" she whispered, voice trembling, raw with confusion. His eyes met hers, unflinching. "Because if I don't," he said quietly, "then I'm nothing but the monster you think I am. And I can't live with that anymore." The words struck her like lightning. Hatred, fear, grief, they all collided inside her, chaotic and unrelenting. Yet beneath it all, something fragile and unexpected began to bloom. Understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that the man who had once been her enemy might now be the only one who could help her survive and reclaim herself. She straightened, hands still trembling, and glanced at the scouts below, their shadows stretching thin in the morning light. The path ahead remained perilous, but for the first time, she felt a spark, a dangerous, thrilling, terrifying spark of trust. The river stretched below them like a glinting ribbon of silver, its surface broken by jagged rocks and currents that roared as though daring them to cross. She perched on the ridge, knees drawn up, fingers brushing the coarse rope he had handed her, heart hammering in her chest. Below, the scouts regrouped, shadows darkening the forest like vultures circling prey. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but the man beside her remained steady, his gaze fixed on the river and the path beyond. "We cross now," he said, voice calm but edged with urgency. "Once we're in the river, they can't follow without taking the risk of getting swept away. You have to move with me exactly as I tell you." She nodded, swallowing hard, terror twisting her stomach into knots. Trust him. The words were bitter on her tongue, yet they carried the truth she could not escape. Survival demanded it. Her hatred burned still, raw and unrelenting. But in that moment it shared space with something stranger, an understanding that the man who had shattered her life was also the only one capable of saving it. Step by careful step, they descended the jagged slope, branches clawing at their clothes, stones threatening to send them tumbling. She slipped once, but his hand shot out, gripping hers with iron certainty. "Don't look down. Focus on me," he ordered, voice steady, commanding, alive with the sharp authority of someone who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the river drew closer, the roar of the current drowning out all other sound. The scouts below shouted, voices rising in frustration and fury, but the wind carried their words away, powerless to reach them on the ridge. She glanced at him, and for a fleeting instant, the man she had feared and hated became human, flawed, burdened, yet undeniably real. They reached the riverbank. Cold mist rose from the water, wrapping around them like a warning. He took her hand, gripping it firmly. "Once we enter, don't hesitate. Move with me, trust me, or we both drown." Her fingers clenched his, white-knuckled, eyes wide and unblinking. Trust. The word felt like a rope around her throat, tight and suffocating, yet necessary. She could not survive alone. She had no other choice. The current of the river mirrored the torrent of emotions inside her: fear, rage, grief, and a faint, trembling spark of hope. Step by step, they entered the icy water, the chill cutting through her like fire. The river pulled at their legs, demanding every ounce of strength and concentration. She clung to him, every motion synchronized, every heartbeat echoing in rhythm with the crashing waters. Hatred flared within her, but survival demanded more than rage. It demanded obedience, focus, and a fragile trust she wasn't ready to admit she was beginning to feel. Midway across, a shout rang from the far bank. One of the scouts had caught sight of them. Fear gripped her, sharp and immediate, but he pressed forward, guiding her through the treacherous current. Every movement was a negotiation between panic and reason, terror and determination. And somehow, against the roar of the river, they kept moving inch by inch until the opposite bank loomed, jagged but reachable. As their feet touched solid ground, the girl stumbled, the water dripping from her hair and clothes, but he steadied her instantly. She gasped for breath, shivering, exhausted and yet alive. For the first time in days, the forest behind them seemed distant, the scouts mere shadows fading in the distance. Survival had carried them here, but the river had changed something fundamental. The fragile thread of trust had begun to weave itself into something tangible, something she could not yet name. The riverbank was slick and treacherous, water still dripping from their hair and clothes, searing cold that left her trembling to the bone. She sank to the ground, knees drawn up, trying to catch her breath, but the adrenaline still hammered in her chest. The roar of the river behind them was a victory, yet it felt hollow. Survival had carried them across, but danger was never far behind. The scouts had not disappeared. They were regrouping, their voices muffled but determined. A constant reminder that the world outside would never forgive weakness. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing lightly across her shoulder, steadying her trembling form. "We can't stay here," he said softly. His eyes scanned the tree line, sharp and calculating. "We need to move before they regroup. Keep your head, and keep close to me." She swallowed hard, shivering, and nodded, though every fiber of her body screamed exhaustion. She hated that she depended on him, hated the way her pulse raced when he touched her, hated the tiny spark of relief that flared within her when he stayed close. And yet there it was, the undeniable truth that she could not survive this world alone. that he was the only tether between life and death. Fear and safety. The forest beyond the river was dense, dark, and alive with danger. Branches clawed at their faces and clothes. Roots threatened to trip them at every step, and shadows shifted with a predatory patience. Every step demanded concentration, trust, and courage. And slowly, painfully, she realized that survival was no longer just about endurance. It was about cooperation, about accepting help from the one she had sworn to despise. He led her through a narrow path, voice low and calm, but every movement taut with tension. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I will get us through this. One step at a time. Don't falter and don't look back." Her chest rose and fell rapidly as they moved, fear and rage clashing violently inside her. Memories of her family's screams, the fire, the ruin. They all pressed down like a crushing weight. Yet in the same breath, the presence of the man beside her was a paradoxical comfort. He had killed the world she once knew, yet now he was the only reason she clung to the present. They emerged into a small clearing, sunlight filtering through the trees, a fragile respite from the oppressive darkness of the forest. She dropped to her knees again, exhausted, wet, and trembling, but he did not let her rest long. "We have to keep moving," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "They won't stop until they find us." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time the hatred and fear she had carried like armor felt raw, brittle, and insufficient. Something dangerous and fragile had begun to take root. Trust, not full trust, not forgiveness, but a recognition that survival demanded she accept the man for what he was now, not only for what he had been. A rustle in the undergrowth made them both freeze. The scouts were closer than she had realized. Her pulse surged, but she clung to the rope and his hand, moving as one with him, heart synchronized with the rhythm of the forest and the silent understanding that every decision, every hesitation could mean death. And then, as the clearing opened into a faint path leading further into the woods, she realized something terrifying and exhilarating. The journey had changed her. She was no longer just the terrified girl who had hidden in the ashes of her home. She was becoming someone who could endure, who could survive, who could face the impossible and live. The riverbank was slick and treacherous, water still dripping from their hair and clothes, searing cold that left her trembling to the bone. She sank to the ground, knees drawn up, trying to catch her breath, but the adrenaline still hammered in her chest. The roar of the river behind them was a victory, yet it felt hollow. Survival had carried them across, but danger was never far behind. The scouts had not disappeared. They were regrouping, their voices muffled but determined, a constant reminder that the world outside would never forgive weakness. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing lightly across her shoulder, steadying her trembling form. "We can't stay here," he said softly. His eyes scanned the tree line, sharp and calculating. "We need to move before they regroup. Keep your head and keep close to me." She swallowed hard, shivering, and nodded, though every fiber of her body screamed exhaustion. She hated that she depended on him, hated the way her pulse raced when he touched her, hated the tiny spark of relief that flared within her when he stayed close. And yet there it was, the undeniable truth that she could not survive this world alone, that he was the only tether between life and death, fear and safety. The forest beyond the river was dense, dark, and alive with danger. Branches clawed at their faces and clothes, roots threatened to trip them at every step, and shadows shifted with a predatory patience. Every step demanded concentration, trust, and courage. And slowly, painfully, she realized that survival was no longer just about endurance. It was about cooperation, about accepting help from the one she had sworn to despise. He led her through a narrow path, voice low and calm, but every movement taut with tension. "Listen to me," he whispered. "I will get us through this. One step at a time. Don't falter, and don't look back." Her chest rose and fell rapidly as they moved, fear and rage clashing violently inside her. Memories of her family's screams, the fire, the ruin. They all pressed down like a crushing weight. Yet in the same breath, the presence of the man beside her was a paradoxical comfort. He had killed the world she once knew, yet now he was the only reason she clung to the present. They emerged into a small clearing, sunlight filtering through the trees, a fragile respite from the oppressive darkness of the forest. She dropped to her knees again, exhausted, wet and trembling, but he did not let her rest long. "We have to keep moving," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "They won't stop until they find us." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time the hatred and fear she had carried like armor felt raw, brittle, and insufficient. Something dangerous and fragile had begun to take root. Trust. Not full trust. Not forgiveness. But a recognition that survival demanded she accept the man for what he was now, not only for what he had been. A rustle in the undergrowth made them both freeze. The scouts were closer than she had realized. Her pulse surged, but she clung to the rope and his hand, moving as one with him, heart synchronized with the rhythm of the forest, and the silent understanding that every decision, every hesitation could mean death. And then, as the clearing opened into a faint path leading further into the woods, she realized something terrifying and exhilarating. The journey had changed her. She was no longer just the terrified girl who had hidden in the ashes of her home. She was becoming someone who could endure, who could survive, who could face the impossible and live. The forest seemed to close around them, every shadow stretching long and menacing as the late afternoon sun pierced through ragged branches. The girl's muscles screamed with exhaustion. Her lungs burned from constant exertion, and yet every nerve in her body remained taut with anticipation. Ahead, the scouts were no longer just shadows in the distance. They were hunters, eyes sharp, rifles ready, closing the net around them with ruthless precision. The man glanced at her, jaw tight, eyes unreadable but commanding. "We don't have time to hesitate. One wrong move and it's over," he said, voice low, tense, carrying the weight of every choice that had brought them here. His hand brushed hers briefly as he handed her a sharpened branch for defense. The contact was fleeting, yet it struck her with the gravity of their shared ordeal. Trust forged in fire, fear, and survival. Her fingers tightened around the branch, knuckles white, pulse hammering. Hatred still coiled inside her, bitter and raw. But beneath it, something else had begun to stir. Recognition that survival wasn't just about running or fighting. It was about facing the impossible, alongside someone she hated and depended on in equal measure. The scouts' voices grew louder, closer, snapping branches underfoot like the ticking of a clock counting down their lives. The girl swallowed, fear clawing at her throat, but she refused to falter. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured, as they pressed forward toward a narrow clearing where the forest opened into a thin, rocky ridge. It was a precarious path. One slip and the fall could be fatal. But there was no turning back. "They're splitting up," he whispered, eyes scanning the tree line. "Two to flank us, two in front. We need to act fast, use the ridge to our advantage." The girl's stomach lurched, but adrenaline sharpened her senses. She followed him closely, mimicking his movements with an instinct born from fear and necessity. The man's hand gripped hers as they crouched behind jagged rocks, whispering instructions with precision. Every second stretched, every heartbeat magnified, and the forest seemed to hold its breath with them. Suddenly, a scout stepped into view, rifle trained on their hiding spot. The girl's chest tightened, but before she could react, the man moved with fluid, terrifying efficiency. A sharp, calculated strike, and the scout crumpled silently to the ground, eyes wide with shock. Her breath caught, horror and awe colliding inside her. This was the man who had taken her family's lives, yet now he was her shield, her guide, the arbiter between life and death. Another shout rang from the tree line. The remaining scouts were closing in, alerted by the fallen comrade. The girl felt fear surge, icy and sharp, threatening to paralyze her. But he pressed a hand to her back, pushing her forward with gentle force. "Move. Trust me," he said, voice low but unyielding. Step by careful step, they navigated the ridge, rocks biting at their hands and feet, the scouts closing relentlessly. Her mind raced, torn between hatred, fear, and a strange, fragile trust that had taken root in the crucible of survival. She realized in a moment of clarity that terrified her, that she could not make it alone. She depended on him, and perhaps in some unspoken, forbidden way, he depended on her too. As they reached the end of the ridge, the girl paused for a split second, eyes sweeping the forest below. The scouts were regrouping, the net tightening, but the ridge gave them a tactical advantage, a chance, perhaps their only chance, to turn the pursuit into opportunity. She glanced at him, and for the first time, fear and hatred merged with something else. Determination, courage, and a thread of understanding forged in shared terror. The scouts' shouts were deafening, bouncing off the rocky ridge and carrying through the forest like a relentless drumbeat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to vanish into the wilderness, but the man's hand gripped hers, firm and unyielding, pulling her back from the edge of panic. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, steady, commanding, and for the first time the anger she had carried for so long began to fracture under the pressure of necessity. Survival demanded cooperation, even from the man she had hated with every fiber of her being. "Move," he hissed, voice low, sharp, but carrying a strange, protective authority. "Follow me exactly. Hesitate and it's over." Fear surged in her chest, clawing at her lungs, yet adrenaline sharpened every sense. The scouts were close now, rifle barrels glinting in the dappled sunlight, their eyes cruel and calculating. Step by careful step, they navigated the ridge, bodies low, hearts hammering in synchrony with the rhythm of the forest. Every snap of a twig was a threat, every shift of shadow a potential death sentence. She had no choice but to trust him completely, and that realization burned with an uncomfortable clarity. Suddenly, one scout lunged forward, raising his rifle to fire. The man moved like a shadow, fluid and precise, striking with lethal efficiency, disarming the threat before a shot could ring out. The girl froze, eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Hatred flared, a bitter reminder of the past, yet beneath it a fragile thread of trust began to take root. He had once destroyed her world, and now he was saving it, moment by moment, breath by breath. The remaining scouts surged, closing in from the tree line. The girl's hands shook violently, but his steadying grip and calm directives grounded her. "Keep low, stay close, and follow my lead," he whispered, the forest swallowing their words. Her pulse raced, each heartbeat echoing the tension between fear and necessity. She realized that survival demanded more than obedience. It demanded courage she had never known she possessed. As they reached the narrowest point of the ridge, a misstep could have been fatal. But he guided her forward, hands brushing hers, eyes locking in a fleeting, silent communication. Trust. Her breath came in ragged gasps, body slick with sweat and dirt. Yet every nerve was alive with the singular focus of staying alive. She had become something new, a survivor forged in fire, terror, and reluctant alliance. A sudden shout from the scouts below broke the fragile rhythm, forcing them into a final, desperate sprint. Rocks shifted beneath their feet, roots clawed at their ankles, but the man never faltered. He pulled her with him, every step measured, precise, until they burst into a narrow clearing at the ridge's edge. The scouts hesitated, unsure, momentarily, halted by the terrain, giving the girl a heartbeat of breathing space. She collapsed briefly, shivering violently, and the man knelt beside her, scanning the forest with eyes that carried both weariness and determination. "We made it this far," he said quietly. "But survival isn't over. Not yet. You have to trust that I'll keep you alive, and you have to keep moving." Her hands clenched the branch, knuckles white, body trembling. Hatred, fear, and grief swirled within her, but beneath it all, she felt something new, a fragile understanding, the dangerous first spark of trust. She looked at him fully, really, saw the man who had once been her enemy, now the only reason she might survive. The forest was still merciless, the scouts still a threat, but for the first time she felt that together, they could endure. The forest was quieter now, but the silence felt heavier than any scream. The girl's muscles ached, her lungs burned, and yet every fiber of her being remained alert, attuned to the faintest whisper of movement. The scouts were still in pursuit, their distant shouts carried on the wind, but the man beside her had shifted from a predator to a guardian, guiding her through the dense undergrowth with a precision born of experience and necessity. They reached a narrow ravine where the river widened, the water swirling with icy currents that promised both danger and escape. She hesitated at the edge, toes brushing the cold, unforgiving water. Fear coiled tight around her chest, Memories of the raid, the fire, the screams rising like a ghost from the past. But he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, grounding her, anchoring her in the present. "We can make it across," he said, voice low, calm, but carrying an edge of steel. "I'll be right beside you, one step at a time." Her hands trembled as she gripped the rope he had fashioned for their crossing. Trust. It still tasted bitter on her tongue, but she had no choice. Hatred had carried her this far. Fear had sharpened her instincts, and now survival demanded something new. Reliance. She glanced at him, seeing the fatigue etched into his face, the shadow of guilt that lingered in his eyes, and the realization struck her with painful clarity. The man who had destroyed her past was now the one holding her life in his hands. Step by careful step, they entered the river, the icy water biting at their legs, threatening to sweep them away. Every motion demanded coordination, every breath measured, every heartbeat synchronized. She stumbled once, and he caught her instantly, pulling her closer against the relentless current. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, adrenaline and terror intertwining. Yet beneath the panic, a strange, fragile sense of partnership began to form, a bond forged in fire, water, and shared desperation. Above them, the scouts paused at the riverbank, rifles raised, uncertain of how to proceed. The current was treacherous, the rocks jagged, and the girl realized with a surge of clarity. For once, they held the advantage. But survival was never guaranteed. One misstep, one hesitation, and death could claim them both. Halfway across, the sudden gust of wind carried a shouted command, and the girl froze. Her hands gripped the rope tighter, knuckles white, heart hammering. He pressed close, murmuring instructions, guiding her through the treacherous water. Fear and rage coiled within her, yet something else, trust, fragile but undeniable, pushed her forward. By the time they reached the far bank, the scouts' shouts were distant, the river having created a temporary barrier between predator and prey. The girl collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving, wet and trembling, yet alive. The man knelt beside her, scanning the forest, his presence both a shield and a reminder of the impossible bond that had formed between them. Why do you keep helping me?" she whispered, voice raw, trembling with exhaustion and confusion. He looked at her, eyes steady and unflinching, shadowed with guilt and something softer, almost human. "Because if I don't," he said quietly, "we both die. And because maybe it's the only thing left I can do to balance the scales." The words struck her, reverberating through the storm of emotions inside her. Hatred, fear, grief, they all collided, chaotic and unrelenting. Yet beneath it all, a fragile spark of understanding flickered. She realized that survival was not just physical, it was emotional, and if she failed to navigate that terrain, she could lose herself entirely. The forest was quiet now, almost eerily so, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The girl and the man crouched behind a tangle of roots and fallen branches, eyes fixed on the scouts now far enough away that the immediate threat had faded, but not disappeared. Every nerve in her body remained taut, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, but beneath it, a fragile awareness had begun to take root. They had survived against impossible odds together. She shivered, wet and exhausted, muscles trembling from exertion, and the man's presence beside her was a grounding force she could no longer deny. Hatred still lingered, a bitter echo of the past, but now it intertwined with something more complex: trust, reliance, and a quiet, painful understanding of the man who had once been her enemy. She turned to him, searching his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man beneath the guilt, the rage, and the history of violence, a man who had been broken by his own choices, yet now stood beside her as both shield and guide. Are you going to leave me?" she asked, voice trembling, raw with exhaustion and emotion. He shook his head, eyes dark and unreadable, yet carrying a glimmer of something fragile, almost tender. "No," he said quietly. "I can't. Not now. Not after everything." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. Trust was a dangerous thing, but survival had taught her that it was necessary. She had hated him, feared him, and yet, in the crucible of the forest, she had learned to rely on him, to move with him, to survive because of him. And somewhere, deep inside, that reliance had begun to transform into something she could not yet name. But that felt irrevocable. The scouts' voices were distant now, mere echoes carried by the wind. The immediate threat had passed, but danger still lingered in the edges of the forest, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The girl rose slowly, shivering, and he offered his hand. She took it without hesitation, the simple act heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. She had survived, yes, but she had also survived because of him. Together, they moved from the riverbank, each step deliberate, careful, yet filled with a new purpose. The forest stretched ahead, still dark, still dangerous, but no longer insurmountable. She realized in a moment of clarity that terrified and exhilarated her, that survival was not just about escaping the scouts or outrunning danger. It was about facing the world with someone who had once been her enemy, now her companion in the fight for life. A shaft of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the path ahead, and she paused, breathing in the crisp air, letting the warmth seep into her bones. For the first time, she felt something beyond fear and hatred, possibility. A new beginning, fragile and uncertain, but real. He glanced at her, a fleeting smile breaking through the exhaustion etched on his face. "We've made it," he said softly, though both knew the journey was far from over. "But we're alive. That's what matters." She nodded, words failing. Her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the enormity of what had happened. The terror, the grief, the relentless pursuit of survival, and now the delicate thread of trust binding them together. She had been orphaned by fire and violence, forced to live in fear, and yet against all odds she had endured. And she had endured not alone, but alongside the man who had once been her greatest enemy. The first light of morning crept through the trees, painting the forest in gold and amber, softening the jagged edges of the world that had so recently threatened to consume them. The girl stood on a small rise, the river behind her glinting, like molten silver, the forest alive with birdsong and the subtle rustle of leaves. She breathed deeply, the chill in the air mingling with a fragile warmth that had begun to grow in her chest. Survival was no longer just a struggle. It was a testament to everything she had endured. Beside her, the man knelt, examining the rope and gear they had carried through the forest, but his eyes never left her. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other in silence, the weight of the past hovering between them like a shadow neither could ignore. He had been the cause of her nightmares, the architect of her loss, and yet he had also become her guardian, her unlikely ally in a world that had tried to break her. The paradox was uncomfortable, but undeniable. She stepped closer, hesitant, muscles still trembling from exhaustion and emotion. I don't know how to feel," she admitted, voice small, almost lost in the vastness of the forest. "Hate, fear, gratitude, it's all tangled up." He exhaled slowly, a rough human sound that carried both relief and regret. "You don't have to untangle it all right now," he said. "Survival isn't about understanding everything. It's about enduring, moving forward, and, sometimes, trusting." His hand hovered near hers, but he did not reach. Instead, he let the moment hang, fragile, delicate, as if waiting for her to decide whether to bridge the gap between them. Her fingers brushed his, brief but electric, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed in the crucible of fire, blood, and relentless pursuit. She realized that survival had shaped her, hardened her, but also opened her to something she had never anticipated. The possibility of connection, even with the one she had feared most. Hatred still lingered, but it had softened into something sharper, more focused, awareness, understanding, and a tentative willingness to forgive the impossibility of his past. Behind them, the river's roar softened to a gentle murmur, its currents reflecting the sky above. The scouts had vanished, driven away by circumstance, and the narrow margin of luck that had kept them alive. The forest, once a cage and a battleground, now felt like a witness to their endurance, a quiet participant in the story of survival and fragile redemption. She turned fully to him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time she felt no fear. "We made it," she whispered, and the words carried both relief and wonder. "Against everything. We made it." He nodded, eyes dark and heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Yes, against everything. And now, we decide what comes next." The girl breathed in the crisp morning air, letting it fill her lungs, letting it wash away the remnants of terror and grief. The future was uncertain, the scars of the past still raw, but for the first time she felt the tentative spark of hope. They had survived the forest, the scouts, and the ghosts of her lost childhood. And now, standing side by side, they could face whatever came next. Together, not as captor and captive, but as two flawed, scarred people who had found a fragile alliance in the chaos of a cruel world. A hawk cried above, circling the rising sun, and she lifted her eyes, letting its cry echo in her chest. Freedom, survival, and the dawn of something new awaited. The forest, once a place of terror and loss, now held promise. The past had shaped them, scarred them, and tested them, but it had also forged an unspoken bond, one that might, if nurtured carefully, grow into something enduring.